Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Frontiers in Oncology webinar sponsored by the Stanford Cancer Institute. My name is Elise Adams. I'm Associate Director for Community Outreach and Engagement here at SCI. Today, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Erin Kobetz. Dr. Kobetz is a tenured professor in the Departments of Medicine, Public Health Sciences and Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Additionally, she's Associate Director of Population Science and Cancer Disparities at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, as well as the Chief of Population Health and Cancer Disparities for UHealth Oncology Service Line. She also serves as Program Director for the Community Engagement and Multidisciplinary Team Science components of UM's CTSA and is the university's Vice Provost for Research. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Kobetz. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. So I had to think about that for a second because on the East Coast, I'm starting to get rapidly towards lunchtime. It is a pleasure to be here today. And as I told Dr. Adams and Maria, as we were ensuring that I had adequate ability to navigate slides, I ended up changing the focus of my talk to one that's more oriented around lessons learned. I did this somewhat intentionally because I am in a professional crisis where I'm trying to figure out who I want to be when I grow up. And I'm hoping that the lessons learned give me that clarity. So I think it always helps to provide a little bit of a backstory or orientation to how I ended up doing the work that I do. I was recruited to the University of Miami straight out of my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill about 17 years ago. That ages me pretty tremendously. And I was recruited by the then Cancer Center director, a really wonderful man named Dr. Jerry Goodwin, who was trying to conceptualize how Sylvester could achieve NCI designation. And Jerry had the necessary foresight to recognize that if Sylvester wanted to be NCI designated, that what we were really going to have to do was capitalize on the unique multiculturalism that is the hallmark of South Florida. And he recruited me to help us develop research that was catchment relevant, though at the time we didn't use that terminology, locally relevant cancer research. And he really wanted me to focus on disparities and diversity and better appreciate the unique variability within cancer burden across South Florida. And so I did what any good epidemiologist would do. I started mapping the local distribution of cancer throughout the Miami metropolitan area. I was actually really focused on cervical cancer because in my mind, cervical cancer is an objective marker of health disparity. When women have adequate access to the formal healthcare system, as well as primary and secondary prevention, they may develop but do not die of cervical cancer. And so I was curious to understand whether or not there would be an undue burden of cervical cancer within Miami based on feedback that I had heard from some of my new clinical colleagues who suggested that they were seeing what they thought to be an excess burden of this particular disease. Well, their clinical intuition was right. And I did find on my map these areas that suggested that there was an increased incidence of disease 4 times higher than what had been reported for the state of Florida or even the United States as a whole. And I have to tell you that I actually thought that what I was observing was statistical artifact because Miami is a really weird space where there's both urban dwellings and lots of swampland. I was convinced that the disparity that my map identified was actually a function of too few people living in a geographic area and that it wasn't in fact real. But what's really beautiful about maps is that they give you the ability to focus in on cross streets and get in your car and drive. And that's exactly what I did. And not long after being in my car, maybe about 5 minutes, I realized that I was in the ethnic enclave of Little Haiti. And the only reason I knew that this was Little Haiti, much to my embarrassment so many years later, was because of the predominance of signs in a language other than English or Spanish. So here's my first lesson, know your why. So what ended up happening is I got back in my car, I went back to the School of Medicine and tried to engage my senior colleagues in conversation about the possibility of pursuing collaborative research in Little Haiti to better appreciate the complex etiology of this disparity that I had just identified through my mapping exercise. And my colleagues were really negative about this notion. In fact, they tried extremely hard to dissuade me from pursuing this line of inquiry that I was so committed to. I mean, I found this disparity. I felt like there was an opportunity and obligation, and believed very strongly that this was aligned with the very reason why Dr. Goodwin had recruited me to the Cancer Center in the first place. And so my number one lesson was know your why, because I was naive and perhaps egotistical enough not to heed their advice. I was not persuaded about their arguments about how doing this work would negatively impact my tenurability. I didn't really care or appreciate the importance of tenure at this point in my career. And I thought, this is why I do science. I believe strongly that my research should be a vehicle for social justice, and here is an opportunity by which to play this out in a very real way. And I have to tell you that this is still my why, that we can do translational research that really leads to impactful, measurable change on community and population levels. And staying true to that ethos for me has been essential throughout my career. And the work that I'm going to tell you about has been funded by the National Institutes of Health and the American Cancer Society for this entire duration, because there is power in work that brings universities and communities together to accomplish a mutually beneficial research agenda. Okay, so I got doors shut on me in the University of Miami and went back to Little Haiti to try to engage community partners who at that point I had identified through what was then like AOL, because this is predating Google, in conversation about the potential of doing research together. And my welcome there was not as warm as I anticipated. And I think part of this is because I hadn't done adequate homework, maybe to even appreciate the skepticism that my university colleagues were putting forth as rationale for why I shouldn't go down what they saw to be an academic rabbit hole. So what I didn't know, and what I later came to appreciate, was that in Little Haiti, there was an inherent historical skepticism about research and the benefit for community health. Why? Well, during the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, Haitian ancestry was erroneously labeled as a risk factor for transmission by the Centers for Disease Control. Now, the research that substantiated the increased prevalence of this infectious disease, which was then actually called gay-related infectious disease, actually came from the University of Miami. And it wasn't bad research. I mean, it was actually pretty good epidemiologic research substantiating an unequal distribution of a new infection within a vulnerable population subgroup. But the way that that research was manipulated by the media led to almost the legitimized discrimination of a group of people who were already very much living on the margins. And so when I tried to approach community members with a conversation about research, it was almost as if I was uttering a dirty word, because research for Little Haiti had been deleterious. And even to this day, there are people in the Little Haiti community who speak about how they have not appropriately lived down the stigma of having their ethnic identity incorrectly associated with an infectious condition. And arguably, their research experience, both in that context and then in others that followed, had been one of what I would call parachute science, where colleagues of mine who were well-intended landed in Little Haiti when they got federal research dollars to examine HIV or other chronic conditions. But as they developed findings and analyzed those findings, they ultimately just published them in peer-reviewed journals that were only read by people such as ourselves, and never then shared the findings with the Little Haiti community so that they could ultimately translate them into actionable opportunity. And so it was really important for me to appreciate, and it's a lesson that I've never ever forgotten, that even though my intent to do collaborative research was good, I unwittingly inherited the institutional baggage of the University of Miami and the community's past experience of doing research that led to social inequity. So what did I do about this? Well, my number 3 lesson is that there's pretty tremendous power in partnership. So I need you guys to back up to about 17 years ago. I'm a new recruit at the University of Miami. I stumble into this community that has an undue burden of preventable disease. There's all of this historical skepticism about research and research participation. And I realize that I'm going to have to turn traditional research epistemology on its head, and that I'm not going to be able to approach this from the traditional researcher research orientation, but then I'm going to have to I'm going to have to use community-based participatory research, which at the time was just a burgeoning methodology getting traction in the space of medicine and public health. So now I know that sounds completely ridiculous because CBPR is the hallmark of what many NCI designated cancer centers strive for, particularly as part of our community outreach and engagement expectations and obligations. But at this time, it was extraordinarily new. But to work in Little Haiti meant that we had to work together, and that I had to invite community members to the table as co-investigators and collaborators, and that we really needed to bridge this traditional chasm between the researcher and researched, and collaboratively and collectively identify not only the focus of research, but also how we were going to legitimately ask research questions with methods and data collection strategies that resonated with the community's cultural preferences and linguistic constraints. And so I built what was ever the first ever campus community partnership at the University of Miami. It's called Patne en Acción, and it brings together diverse scientists and scholars from the University of Miami with diverse leaders in Little Haiti. And we have worked together over the past 17 years to try to understand the complex etiology from cell to society of the cervical cancer and other cancer disparities within the Haitian diaspora community. Just because I know that Dr. Adams is on the call and I know that you all are gearing up for your CCSG renewal, it was this campus community partnership that ultimately served as the backbone for how the Cancer Center organizes its orientation to community engaged scholarship. We have multiple community advisory boards throughout our catchment area, which is South Florida, and we work collaboratively with these community advisory boards to ensure that there is alignment between our research priorities and local need, and there to be ongoing bidirectional exchange of information for what local challenges exist and how the Cancer Center can potentially meet those challenges through outreach and also research. Okay, so just because I wasn't sure the audience that I was speaking to, and because I never really get the opportunity to teach in all of my administrative roles, I thought it was really important to talk about why community input really matters. And so here I offer up a diagram from Jeffrey Rose's book, The Paradox of Prevention. And what Jeffrey Rose was arguing, if any of you remember his thesis, was that there needed to be a bit of a separation between medicine and public health. That inherently, both of these fields had different orientations and different goals. And what Jeffrey Rose would argue is that medicine, and certainly quaternary care centers or health systems like the one that I work in at the University of Miami, are really focused on those individuals who are at the tail end of the distribution, those who are at high risk for a certain health condition. And what you see here on the slide is for uncontrolled blood pressure. What Jeffrey Rose was arguing is that public health really has an obligation to modify conditions that affect all persons regardless of their individual propensity for disease, thereby shifting the population distribution of risk back. And so when you think about what Jeffrey Rose is saying, community-based participatory research fits squarely there, because who better to articulate and orient a scientist to the multi-level social and structural determinants that impede health, influence biology, and constrain or promote health behavior than people whose lives are characterized by the very disparity the research is intending to change. So here's my number 4 lesson, that truth is a social construct. And this was a very hard lesson for me to learn because I am the daughter of a physician and the wife of a physician and a public health scholar, and very much have always believed that Western medicine is a form of truth. When I started working with the Little Haiti community, I came to appreciate that this particular community and many other Afro-Caribbean communities throughout South Florida actually approach disease etiology from a pluralistic understanding, where Western medicine ends up being interspersed with more lay interpretations of disease, such as humoral theory, which are popular in the Caribbean at large. So what did I find out? So when I started to speak to community members about why there was such an increased risk of cervical cancer within Little Haiti, there was tremendous dissonance between what I perceived based on my appreciation of academic literature and what they prioritize based on lived reality. So I assumed that the number one determinant was lack of access to and underutilization of pap smear screening, because at the time, pap smear screening was still the gold standard for cervical cancer prevention. This was before there was a vaccine for HPV. And, you know, when you looked at the data, which was actually hard to appreciate because the behavioral risk factor surveillance system reports screening on a county or zip code level, as opposed to a census tract, which is actually the size of Little Haiti, there seemed to be potentially a gap in screening practice, which we were later able to validate through primary data collection. But it was not just that pap smear screening was underutilized. It was about the complexity of what pap smear screening represented to Haitian women in this community. So what do I mean? Women were not just getting were not failing to get pap smears simply because of lack of access. Women were not getting pap smears because they perceive the pap smear in and of itself to be extraordinarily problematic. So what do I mean? Women would tell me that when the speculum was introduced into the vagina, that it potentially changed the tone or rigidity in such a way that they would no longer be sexually desirable to their male partners. And so here, cervical cancer gets situated in gender politics, which often go beyond our ability to negotiate as scientists. But it was even more complicated than that. So women also believed that when the vagina was open for a speculum exam, that it allowed for the introduction of gas or gauze, which is this sort of amorphous etiologic factor, to get left in the vagina and potentially cause disease. It went even further. So, you know, women believed that cervical cancer was actually a maladie mo, which is a supernatural illness, or an illness that's sent by supernatural cause. And what you actually see here on the screen are veves, and these are the physical representation of different voodoo gods that voodoo priests or priestesses, who we call Mambo or Ugan, call upon as part of ritual ceremony for different purposes. And so when women tell you that a disease is caused by supernatural origin, it becomes really hard to situate something like a pap smear within that context, because they inherently believe that the disease itself is fatal and that there's no intervention that can dissuade the course. So again, very important to do community-based participatory research, because had I not worked collaboratively with communities and just opened free pap smear clinics, they would have continued to be underutilized. Okay, so look for inspiration in unlikely places and people. So what ended up happening was my community members really pushed me very, very hard to try to come up with another strategy for cervical cancer prevention besides the pap smear, given all the cultural structure and access barriers that Haitian women articulated as constraining their ability to do good cervical cancer prevention. And one of my really, really smart medical school students at the time, who happens to now be faculty at the University of Washington, came into my office one day, all red-faced and excited, and she had identified a paragraph in the old book, Our Bodies, Our Cells, from the 1970s, that talked about a concept of self-sampling, where women would have the ability to self-collect cervical and vaginal cells in the privacy of their own homes that could ultimately be submitted to a lab for analysis of sexually transmitted infections and potentially cytology. And my medical student was curious whether or not there was any validity to what was being discussed in our bodies ourselves, and whether it had advanced beyond the pages of this self-help book in the women's movement to something that had practical clinical application. Well, as luck would have it, because luck is a big part of my career, there were a number of trials that were just wrapping up, being led by the National Institutes of Health, that were substantiating self-sampling as a method that was just as efficacious as a physician-collected specimen for detecting HPV, the principal cause of cervical cancer. Now, what was so interesting about these trials is they were just looking at self-sampling in and of itself. They weren't thinking about the translation of this innovation from a clinical setting to a community where it could ultimately have the greatest impact, particularly a community like Little Haiti, which was disenfranchised from the formal healthcare system and then further constrained by cultural norms and nuances that sort of didn't uphold the relative importance of cervical cancer screening. So my team became the first team to ever take self-sampling out into the community. But based on the advice of our community advisory board, we decided not to do this through physicians, but to do this through community health workers. And community health workers, as you likely know, are women who are indigenous to community of interest. They often are natural helpers, so they're individuals that others readily turn to for advice and support. And they have very large social networks that could be mobilized for various purposes, including potentially, though untested at the time, cervical cancer prevention. And so what ended up happening is that the community health workers, we decided to do a small pilot study where the community health workers would navigate their social networks to identify women who are unscreened or underscreened for cervical cancer. And we would explore whether self-sampling was both acceptable and feasible. So by acceptable, we wanted to know, did women like it? For those women who had had a prior pap smear, did they prefer this methodology to a physician-collected exam? Would they recommend it to family and friends? And feasible, like could women adequately collect sufficient cervical cells that could actually be submitted to a lab to allow for the detection of HPV? And probably without telling you, you know that it was both acceptable and feasible. And this became the platform for much of my research over the past decade. And in fact, we have now chased it to the tail end of its translational continuum. We are moving to dissemination and implementation of this methodology in our UHealth Walgreens primary care clinics so that we have the ability to serve women who are unscreened and underscreened on a much larger scale. And we've started to pair the self-sampling with a point of care test that we've patented, which allows a community health worker to actually process HPV testing in a test tube just using an isothermal reaction that's heated by their hand. Okay, so now I'm going to transition a little bit and tell you about the work that came to me somewhat unexpectedly and is arguably the greatest privilege of my career, and ties back to that lesson of looking for inspiration in unlikely people. So about 7 years ago, I was in my office and my phone rang and I picked it up, which is something I rarely do. And there was a very distressed man on the other end of the line who identified himself as a battalion chief for the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue. And this man was calling me because he had found my name on Sylvester's website, and he was looking for somebody to help him better appreciate the undue burden of cancer within the fire service. The man who called me was a man named Sam Eden, who is best friends with the man Butch Smith, who you see in the photos. So Butch was about 40 years old when he was diagnosed with stage 4 multiple myeloma. And this came as an extraordinary shock, not just to Butch and Sam, but their broader peer network and that of the Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department broadly. The reason being is Sam was sort of like, Butch was sort of like the caricature of a firefighter, somebody who, you know, was 6'4", full of muscle, and who you could imagine literally running into a burning building and coming out carrying like 4 children in each of his arms. So Butch was thought to be invincible, and his diagnosis really threw everybody for a bit of a loop. Now, what was interesting in further conversation with Butch was not that he was surprised by the diagnosis, but he was surprised by the silence that was surrounding the conversation of cancer in the fire service. And Butch, sort of stared at his mortality and decided that he wanted his life to ultimately represent more than the disease to which he would succumb. And he started the very painful process of trying to break the silence around cancer in the fire service and to try to legitimize the fact that there was a real problem associated with occupational risk that needed to be substantiated by transdisciplinary research. And his commitment to this is what motivated Sam's call to me. Now, I have to tell you, I was extraordinarily reluctant to really explore this conversation with Sam, but he was persistent and he kept calling, much in the way I kept showing up in Little Haiti. And I decided that maybe there was an opportunity and an obligation to pursue this collaborative science to address this really unique disparity. And so that's what we did. And my next lesson is very much grounded in the fact that team science and scholarship is really the best science and scholarship. And I don't have a ton of time to really dig deep into the research that we do as part of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, but the primary goal is really to understand and address the excess burden of cancer among firefighters. And over the years, we have established dozens of interlocking or overlapping projects that move innovative research from bench to trench. And I think arguably one of our most profound findings was what I call the Hansel and Gretel experiment, where we were able to show that when firefighters continue to wear their bunker gear from a live fire in the cab of the truck back to the fire station, and then they put that gear into their personal vehicle, that they leave a trail of carcinogens along their path, which enables exposure and re-exposure to carcinogens, which likely increases their risk of cancer. Now, that work was extraordinarily important because part of the largest skepticism about the research we were doing wasn't the scientific community. It was actually the firefighter community who believed that there was inherent toughness in continuing to wear your gear and the suit from a fire. And changing that culture has taken a really long time, and there still continue to be a number of outliers, but it's profoundly important because that soot and the dermal route of exposure is likely underlying why we continue to see this increased risk of cancer within the fire service. And so just a little bit of overview of some of the science that we've done. In addition to the Hansel and Gretel trail, we were able to pass a legislative amendment in the state of Florida that allowed us to work with our state cancer registry, the Florida Cancer Data System, to appropriately identify firefighters with cancer. So all of you likely know that many of our cancer registries don't do a consistent job of recording occupation, particularly for individuals who are retired. And this really constrains our ability to appreciate variability in cancer between and within occupational groups. So our legislative amendment allowed us to work hand in hand with our state fire marshal's office and to do a merger where we were able to estimate the true risk of cancer in Florida firefighters and also to identify those sites for which the risk of cancer was higher than the general population. And this has been extraordinarily important because it allows for more focused research, both at the bench, the clinic, and in the community, to understand that risk and to think about ways that we might attenuate it, either through better screening, new therapeutic opportunity, or policy. So we've also been trying to understand what particular occupational exposures are driving the increased cancer burden. And what you see here on the top of the slide are these silicone bracelets that, dare I say, were popularized at one point by Lance Armstrong when he still was really cool. You remember the Livestrong bracelets? Well, we actually make a version of these bracelets that firefighters can wear into an active fire. And then afterwards, we're able to use data collected from these bracelets to appreciate the different carcinogens to which firefighters are exposed, and then actually to link that to changes in urine. And this is really important because we're starting to establish the biologic plausibility where exposure leads to biologic changes, which ultimately may underlie a carcinogenic process. And what's more important here from my perspective, because some of this more basic translational research takes years and years to materialize, we were able to share this data with our state fire marshal and also local fire departments and lead to the ready implementation of policies and practices that upheld the importance of post-exposure to contamination while we figure out the biology that contributes to the observed disparity. We are taking active steps to really reduce exposure. We also are looking at DNA methylation. We know that epigenetics is a field that makes a lot of sense within this context because the epigenome is obviously very susceptible to social and environmental exposures. And we've been able, in looking at our tumor bank of firefighter specimens, different pathways of epigenetic deregulation that may actually, in fact, be associated with some of the exposures that we capture through those bracelets and other self-report. And this is obviously really important because we also see the methylation of epigenetic sites that are associated with neighboring genes that are overrepresented within the fire service. And so, you know, here is a community-based research program that has trickled down all to the bench and then actually leads to policy and practice, both in clinical and fire station contexts, to ameliorate risk. You know, I always believe that the mic drop as a scientist is changing policy and practice. And so, you know, why I say the firefighter work is the greatest privilege of my career, it's because we've been able to accomplish that in a really, really short amount of time. So the decon procedures that I referenced on the last slide actually are operationalized in these green buckets that you see on this slide. And these green buckets are what we call decontamination kits. We've since distributed, I don't know, 6,000 throughout the state of Florida. They've been replicated in many states and actually by manufacturers of fire trucks who, based on our research, have started to create new trucks by which where the gear that's worn in a fire is kept separate from the cab where the firefighters themselves sit. And this is intentional because we're trying to reduce exposure. On top of that, we were able to pass legislation that requires all incoming rookies to the fire service to get educational exposure to the risk of cancer within the fire service in and of itself. And this is really important when you're talking about changing the culture. We may have some stalwart older firefighters who, you know, really want to continue to maintain this idea that dirty is the badge of honor, but we are actively changing that in our new recruits by creating a culture that prioritizes clean as a new badge of honor, because decontamination leads to less exposure, which ultimately we hope leads to less cancer. And then more importantly, the work that we did actually led the Florida legislature to pass something that we call cancer presumption, which recognizes, at least in Florida, that cancer in the fire service is occupationally induced and provides extended coverage to firefighters who are diagnosed with cancer. And maybe more exciting, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which for decades has been debating whether or not firefighting is an occupational carcinogen, has decided to reassemble to revisit this very topic. And my closest collaborator in the Firefighter Cancer Project, Dr. Alberto Caban Martinez, has been appointed to that commission and will be at the table debating the science that legitimizes that being a firefighter does impose undue risk of developing and dying from cancer. And so here is my last slide, and then I'm going to open it to questions. Is, my career has taken lots of twists and turns. If you were to ask me 17 years ago, when Jerry Goodwin recruited me to build a program in cancer disparities, if I'd ever be the university's vice provost for research and scholarship, I probably would have laughed you out of the room. Really approach my science from a very mindful orientation, where I never really try to get ahead of where I am in the moment to predict where I may be going. And that said, I'm extraordinarily honored to be the university's vice provost for research and scholarship, because I'm the first woman to ever be in this position. And I'm actually the first ever community-based scientist to have such a role of authority that continues on an institutional level to underscore the necessity of working collaboratively with communities to advance a mutually beneficial agenda, including a pan-university interdisciplinary commitment to advancing health equity for our local community. What you see on this slide is really me and my role as the Associate Director for Sylvester, which arguably is my most treasured professional position. And you see here something called Sylvester's Game Changer. And these vehicles are a critical part of our community outreach and engagement activity. We actually have 2 of them that are on the road, a third one, which is under construction. And these vehicles allow us to really be on the front lines of health advocacy. We are a tangible presence in local communities that are characterized by health disparity and disenfranchised from the formal healthcare system. We use these vehicles as a way to close gaps in cancer education and to provide access to cancer screening, as well as continued conversation about and access to cancer research. And I'm really proud of these vehicles because they serve upwards of 50,000 individuals a year, and we recruit about 10% of those individuals, sometimes more, to our ongoing interventional research portfolio. And I think this is all leads back to Little Haiti, where when I was knocking on those doors of community members who were really skeptical about my intent, one of them said to me, you're not going to be able to bring Mohammed to the mountain. You're going to have to bring the mountain to Mohammed. And I never forgot this. And so as I got more resources and the ability to build infrastructure, realize that perspective through these game changers, who also have been a tremendous resource in these very same communities during COVID, navigating people to testing and also standing up our university's testing response. And so with that, I offer some other lessons, but just really want to thank you for the time and the ability for me to share these lessons and reflections from across my career. I believe the ones on the last slide always go very far and are things that I tell my graduate students and children all the time. It's really important to be a good listener and practice humility. I obviously have a scientific skill set, but it really needs to be married with the lived reality of community members and diverse stakeholders in order for me to accomplish science that has true application to my why, which is to be somebody who really helps move the dial on health equity. I think when working with communities, it's really important to be transparent about your interest and the necessity of ongoing open dialogue about the expectations of collaboration. I ultimately did become tenured, so at some point decided that I really needed to publish or perish. And because the work that I was doing was grounded in the community and ultimately owned by the community, I needed to ensure that there was true shared commitment to advancing this need and also figuring out other appropriate communication channels by which to share results for the community in ways that mattered for them and to them. Be tenacious. Change is a slow and sometimes very painful process. And the other one that I continue to remember, despite having spent 17 years in Little Haiti, is that I'm still an outsider. And sometimes that outsider perspective has tremendous impact because it allows me to sort of retain the objectivity I think that's necessary to know what questions to pursue and how. And also sometimes it allows me necessary distance from the complex politics that play out within communities and between community organizations that are often committed to the same agenda, but are maybe competing for the resources to pursue that for their own respective constituencies. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you have. I thank you for your time and your participation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kobetz. That was just an amazing presentation. Really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your lessons learned with us. I think many of us working in this space could relate to some of your experiences, and certainly appreciated your amazing presentation. I am going to handle the Q&A for Dr. Kobetz. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A box, I'll start to answer those. We've already gotten one question in. So the question is from Dr. Shapira, and she asks, can you give us practical tips for practicing cultural humility?
Oh my God, I think that's an amazing question. So one of the things that I always say is it's important to know what you don't know. And I've got a lot of blinders, you know, I mean, even now after spending so many years in Little Haiti, there are things that I can't readily appreciate because my lived experience is just so extraordinarily different. And so I listen, I honor, I ask questions that are not meant to be pejorative, but intended for clarification. And I allow my community partners to lead with intent and integrity and to really fill in gaps in the things that I don't know. I think it's extraordinarily important, again, to remember that our knowledge as scientists and scholars has real boundaries. And even if I were a member of the Little Haiti community, which I'm not, I still think those boundaries exist by virtue of my different educational trajectory and my position in an authoritative institution like the University of Miami. And I think simply acknowledging those limitations and differences puts us in the right direction to accomplish what's required when trying to bridge cultures of people, places, and practice. I hope I answered that okay.
That was fantastic. Thank you. We have another question from Santiago Sanchez. The question is for basically thank you. And the question is how you think basic scientists can best partner with communities and population health scientists to better understand cancer disparities, and how you navigated this divide in your own collaborations.
So I think that is like such an important question. And I realized as I was going through my talk that I probably should have addressed that straight on. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and then talk about my role as the Associate Director for the Cancer Center and also as the Vice Provost. So in my research, there were things that would come out of our findings. So for example, early on, we came to appreciate that the type distribution of HPV in Little Haiti was different than had been reported in peer-reviewed literature for other populations of women globally. And again, going back to I know what I don't know, that wasn't research that I could pursue in earnest. Like I had done the epidemiology to show that there was variability in type distribution and how it reflected, how it even was correlated with number of years in the US and immigration status and all of that kind of stuff. But to take it a step further and to say, okay, well, what are the biologic underpinnings that may account for this required somebody who wasn't me. So it required me to find people who were at least willing to entertain a conversation about, you have this expertise, are you willing to lend it to this scientific opportunity? And, you know, one of the things that's kept me at the University of Miami for so many years is, as a relatively young institution, I've never met a closed door. Now, part of that may be because I'm extraordinarily tenacious and I don't really take no for an answer, which is a personality trait. But I do believe that many of my basic science colleagues were at least willing to entertain dialogue about the possibility that there was a way that they could contribute. And if not them, who else? And so I think, you know, what I always say to people like Dr. Adams, who are really responsible for ensuring that a comprehensive cancer center like Stanford is bringing basic science into catchment relevant research, is to start with the people who are like at least open to the possibility that their work has application potential. Okay, so you got to start with the people who are ready and willing to at least entertain the conversation, recognizing that when I was having this early talks with basic scientists, I was likely tripping all over myself because I didn't even know what to ask. I mean, I want you to understand, at the time, there was not an FDA approved assay for detecting HPV in the lab. So we were using like PCR and gel. I didn't even know what that was. Like, I had to actually go watch it in a lab to appreciate how each of the different HPV genotypes had a different signature on gel. Somebody had to tell me how to do this. And like, I had to be willing to put aside my ego to have that talk. On an NCI designated cancer center level, it starts at the top. So, you know, the director needs to empower Dr. Adams to be able to have breadth of sort of focus and impact, where she's working with all the other associate directors to ensure that COE priorities trickles down within their respective areas of oversight and impact. So what does that mean practically? That like, you are working with, you know, the associate director of clinical research to ensure that there are trials that are being open that don't only reflect investigator initiated curiosity, but also really map on to local catchment relevant cancer burden. So at Sylvester, I figured out with the associate director for clinical research that we were opening an overwhelming number of trials for early stage breast cancer, which is fine, but most of the women that we were seeing in the community were being diagnosed with late stage disease. So there was this inherent mismatch. And it wasn't to say stop doing the innovative research around early stage diagnosis, but open other trials that meet the burden of cancer within the catchment area and potentially attract participation from diverse communities in those trials. I also think it means coming up with practical ways that basic scientists can align their work to the catchment area. And part of that is in collaboration with population scientists who are willing to work in an interdisciplinary collaboration. But part of it is also making the prevalent cancers known and helping draw those links for the people who are going to be the early adopters. So, for example, one of our program co-leaders for tumor biology is someone who works in gastric and esophageal cancer. And for a long time, he'd be like, I work on the basic mechanisms of H. pylori acquisition and transformation. This is not catchment relevant. And I was like, well, let's back up, right? Who gets H. pylori? Well, in South Florida and in the broader Western Hemisphere, we tend to see it overrepresented in Hispanic populations coming from South and Central America. We know that H. pylori is associated with an increased incidence of gastric cancer. Are there any populations in South Florida where we see this undue burden of disease? Oh shit, there is. And it's occurring in Hispanic populations whose ancestry ties back to South and Central America. Now, it becomes catchment relevant. Well, what do? Can we test for H. pylori in those communities on the Game Changer and identify individuals who in fact are infected? Can we navigate them to therapeutic opportunity, including an endoscopy, where we may be able to collect biologic specimens that you could then use in your research? Sometimes it's just about connecting the dots. I find that most people are not averse to the idea of this collaboration. It's sometimes about just helping them see the pathway to getting there. And that's the best part, right? Because when you can inspire or catalyze this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, you are moving down a translational continuum where ultimately you might inspire changes on a policy or practice level that do what Jeffrey Rose was asking those of us in translational research to accomplish, which is to change the distribution of conditions that affect all individuals regardless of propensity for disease. That was long-winded, but I think you get my point.
That was fantastic. I'm going to take host prerogative to ask a question as well. And so wonderful answers and very, very helpful guidance for those of us working in this space. One of the things that we often come across is that there is this fine line in COE between being responsive to the community and advancing the science. By that, I mean that there are often tensions at the community level, feeling like we're using them as test subjects as opposed to working with them. And I'm just curious about, and part of that obviously is relationship building over a long period of time, but if there are other strategies that you found to be effective in sort of balancing, because the truth is we have to do science, right? That's a part of our modus operandi. And so we can't pretend that that's not a goal of ours. You talked before about transparency, which is incredibly important, but I'm just wondering if you have other thoughts about how to thread that needle.
So I think transparency is extraordinarily important. And, I think back to early in my career where I found this community with this excess burden of tobacco associated cancers. And so we started bringing community members from that area together to really discuss whether or not there was the possibility of collaboration, what they believed were the underlying determinants of what we are observing in the epidemiologic data. And they didn't think this was a problem. They just didn't. Like, this community is, I hate to use the word, but is really the closest thing to Miami's inner city. Lots of public housing, limited opportunity for formal employment or employment in the formal economy, lots of crime, violent crime. And lots of gun violence. And, this group of people that I was sitting with, would tell me yeah, okay, but my neighbor was gunned down walking to the grocery store last week. Really? Cancer is kind of a privilege. And so it got to the point where I had to say, listen, I can only work with you in this space because this is what I am funded and empowered to do. But I do have other connections at the university and I'm willing to facilitate that. But you need to know that all I can really work on with you is sort of cancer. And they made the choice to work with my other colleagues. And I felt like that was a very important lesson for me in this transparency. Now, we have to be transparent about science and scientific priorities, but I think that part of the work has to start way before science. We actually have to be community partners. We have to show up. We have to be there even when it doesn't directly translate into some kind of measurable opportunity for us in that moment. People say to me all the time, when you look at Sylvester's accrual to clinical research, 67% of the individuals self-identify as Hispanic and 25% as Black. That matches our catchment area. And people say, well, how do you do that? And it's well, because we're in communities, we're partners. We are there having that conversation before somebody's sick. We recognize the challenges to research participation, vaccine hesitancy, cancer prevention, and we try to come up with solutions that are community-based, community-oriented, and culturally relevant. And we're bringing our community partners along with us. And there's always that tension. And I think just acknowledging that tension, both to our academic partners and to our community colleagues, goes an extraordinarily long way. I wish there was a easy fix. There's not. But always being honest with yourself and with the constituencies you serve matters. And not everything is going to be catchment relevant, and not everything is going to have community application. I also think it helps to sort of, introduce community members to diverse scientists and vice versa. And sometimes to take community members into a given community that you're trying to serve so that they can appreciate somebody's lived reality. So it doesn't just seem like an academic exercise, but it becomes part of the cognitive framework by which they articulate research questions and think about how to collect data.
That's amazing. I couldn't agree more. I think in that context that you create for the science is incredibly important by bringing groups together, particularly when there's not an ask, right? That's sort of the process of getting to know each other, understanding each other's worlds is incredibly important for building that trust and building those relationships. Thank you so much. We have one more question from Dr. Shakira. She says, following your advice to open cancer treatment trials that are cancer relevant and catchment area relevant, how do you then create a welcoming environment for care at Sylvester for those who may have been traditionally marginalized or may not be able to afford the care offered at a major cancer center?
I'm working on it. I think one of the things that we do well and is not as big of a solution as I think your question necessitates is our community health workers from Sylvester's Office of Outreach and Engagement work with our clinical research coordinators. And there is this sort of co-learning, right? Because the community health workers are the boots on the ground. They're the ones whose day-to-day experience is very much informed by the community's lived reality. And so they're the ones who can best articulate these barriers and then coach the clinical research coordinators on how to adapt certain practices in their patient interactions so that it feels more community competent, not just cultural competent, community competent. That's one way we're working to it. It's not perfect. I think that there's a lot further that we need to go, including potentially thinking about how we open clinical research in some of our FQHC partners so that it's actually occurring in spaces and places where community members feel more comfortable. I think that's a longer strategy, but something that we definitely need to work towards. And, obviously there's the little things, making sure that consents are in all languages. We actually, for many of our multilingual patients, read consents because we've come to appreciate that even though there might be one word in Creole, like an actual translation, it doesn't have cultural consonants. And so what you're asking somebody to do doesn't actually resonate with what they believe they're agreeing to. We orient people to consents in the community. We try to do other innovative things with a community, or are trying to do other innovative things with a community version of our EMR that everybody who interacts with us in the community gets, that also pushes research education and clinical trial opportunity. I think the long answer is I don't really know, and would be happy to work with any of you to figure it out.
Well, we would definitely welcome that. I just want to say thank you so much for, again, sharing your experience and your humility and talking about sort of the challenges of the work that you do. And of course, it's just an honor to talk with you about the many things that you've done, working in close collaboration with your community partners and the accomplishments that you've made together. So again, thank you, Dr. Kobetz, for your attention today and for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Take care.
Bye.